All right, how is everyone doing today? Welcome to my channel. Sorry about the last couple days. Let's just say there have been some technical difficulties, and hopefully things are better now, and we can get back on with the Bible Decode. I believe this is number 236. This channel focuses on impactful theories and discoveries, things that you probably haven't heard of or don't know about, but if you did, they could make a big impact on your life and on life in general. And so we've been looking a lot at the New Testament and exploring the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament. And that is that the New Testament was written not by the apostles of Jesus in Judea, but by the Roman Caesars of the Flavian dynasty of Caesars from 69 until 96 AD, written as a psychological operation against the Jews, who they've been fighting wars against and revolts, putting down revolts and insurrections and riots and assassinations from the Jews for over 100 years. And that culminated in the War of the Jews from 66 to 73 AD. Two of the Flavian emperors, of the three Flavian emperors, Emperor Vespasian and Emperor Titus, were both military generals. Titus is the son of Vespasian. They were both military generals in this war between the Romans and the Jews. They were both wounded in the war, and they were both, witnesses of this long period of Jewish revolt against the Romans, who became the colonizing power there in 63 BC. And they had a very clear motive of what they wanted to do, and that was to mellow out the Jews, or to, tame or domesticate the Jews, to get them to comply with Roman law, because the Jews were a separatist people. They believed that they were the chosen people, and their God was zealous and jealous, along with a number of other personality disorders for God, including obsessive compulsive disorder, a very strong addiction to smoking animal fat, very arbitrary and capricious, indecisive, creating the humans and then trying to wipe them out later. And a God that is so weak that he needs to rest every 7 days. The pagans worship the sun. The sun doesn't take days off. The sun's got to shine every day. If your God is taking every 7 days off, you're going to have problems. But anyway, the Romans were basically trying to take advantage of the fact that the Jews were waiting for a Messiah. They were waiting for a military Messiah who was going to lead them up to overthrow the Romans. And this had been prophesied in the Old Testament. So instead, the Romans decided to write a story of a Jewish Messiah who was a Prince of Peace and believed in rendering under Caesar what is Caesar's, walking the extra mile, and turning the other cheek to oppression, to accept your lot in life, even, and to lionize being poor and meek. These are all things that the Romans wanted the Jews to be. And in general, they they wanted, there's a lot of good, valuable, and holy stuff, righteous stuff in the New Testament, but that's all a limited hangout. The Romans have to put that in there just to, get you to take it seriously as a religious work. But also, the Romans wanted you to be a honest, hardworking, peaceful, law-abiding citizen. That's all they wanted for the Jews. So, when somebody argues, a Christian or somebody argues that, oh, well, why is there so much valuable, pious, righteous stuff in the New Testament? Well, it's there because it serves the purposes of the Romans. Now, if you look at modern day Christians, they follow all that stuff, and they generally are honest, hardworking, law-abiding citizens. But they cherry pick the verses a little bit, and so they, have arrived at a Jesus who is considerably more aggressive and, anti-authoritarian than the one that's actually presented in the Gospels. The only aggressiveness that Jesus shows in the Gospels is aggressiveness against the Jews, overturning the tables of the Jewish money changers at the temple and excoriating the Jews who were selling small animals for the animal sacrifice, and kind of baiting the Pharisees for more or less working on the Sabbath. These are things that go against the Jewish traditions and Jewish rituals, and that is what the Romans want. And then when we get to the Pauline material, the epistles of Paul, which whether you think there are 7 of them or 13 of them or somewhere in between, Paul is even more pro-Roman and anti-Jew than Jesus is. So the bottom line is that this is an attack. The New Testament is an attack from the Romans to the Jews. And they left all kinds of proof. Some of it's circumstantial and some of it's direct. We saw that they had the clear motive. In terms of the method of operation, the Romans were highly skilled at psychological operations, and they had used a number of religions. They created a number of religions for psychological operations purposes just in the first century, not just Christianity, but also like rabbinical Judaism, the cults of Titus and Vespasian, and also the cult of Domitilla, who is, I believe, like their niece of Titus and Vespasian, cousin and niece. I could be wrong about that. She might even be closer related to the Flavians than that. They also had the means and the opportunity, and really they were the only people to have the means and the opportunity, because the Romans had a monopoly on censorship, publishing, and distribution within the empire. Nobody's publishing anything in the Roman Empire unless Caesar approves of it. Another red flag is that the Gospels are written in Greek, which is one of the 2 languages of Rome, and much rarer in Judea, where Aramaic was spoken and very few people knew how to write. The literacy rate was much higher in Rome than it was in Judea. Now, what they did is that they wrote the New Testament backdated the story by 40 years or so to set the story in the early 30s AD. And then at the same time that they wrote the Gospels, they wrote a history of this war between the Romans and the Jews. The 7-volume work is called War of the Jews. And it went out under the name of Josephus, the name of Flavius Josephus, a member of the Flavian dynasty of Caesars, by adoption. According to his autobiography, Josephus was a Jewish military commander in this war until he surrendered to Vespasian. When he surrendered, he defected to the Romans, saying that God now favors the Romans and not the Jews, so I defect. And then he predicted that one day Vespasian would become the new emperor. And when Vespasian did become the new emperor, he hooked up Josephus by pardoning him, bringing him to Rome, hiring him as one of the court historians, and setting him up at a townhouse at Caesar's palace, and adopting him as a member of his family. And if you don't believe that, you're, I think, exercising some healthy skepticism. And I would imagine that Josephus never existed, and that he was just an amalgamation of people, a pseudonym for the Romans, and it was really like Team Josephus. A number of people wrote under the name of Josephus. But anyway, when you read Josephus's War of the Jews and the Gospels at the same time, you know what you're looking for. You're looking for parallels and parables and parodies between the two books. When you do that, the parallels jump off the page. Michael Menescot's in his book Christianity's Origin as a Flavian Secrecy Cult, that just came out last year, found over 250 parallels just in the book of Luke. And some of the parallels are really, literally incredibly strong, where there's absolutely no possibility that they would be coincidental. I've gone over all these in the previous videos, one at a time, bit by bit. But some of them are, things that you could dismiss if they just occurred 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 times. But when there are hundreds of them, then you kind of have to figure that almost all of them are intentional. But then you discover that all of them are intentional when Menescot graphs them on a chart, putting the book of Luke on the vertical axis and War of the Jews on the horizontal axis. He plots a point at all of the 250 plus points, and by doing that creates 5 almost perfect letters in Latin, which is the other language of the Roman Caesars. Most of them were bilingual in Greek and Latin. APTVS. TV, I would suggest, is Titus Vespasian. And I'm not sure about the rest. Arius Piso, possibly, who several different authors believe existed and wrote as Josephus. Either way, the main point is that the Romans not only wrote the Gospels, but they initialed them. They put their initials on them, so that one day you would be able to discover conclusively what they did. But that's not even all of the evidence. Joseph Atwill, in his 2005 book, Caesar's Messiah, looks at the ministry of Jesus and recognizes that the ministry of Jesus is nothing but the military campaign of Titus in Judea. Every single place that Jesus goes, Titus goes. Or I would say it the other way. Every single place that Titus goes, Jesus goes. In the same order. And at each location, they undergo parallel events. And each event is separated by 40 years of time. And we're talking about over 40 separate events. Also, many of the prophecies, or really all of the prophecies Jesus makes in the New Testament, are fulfilled in the pages of the War of the Jews, including the most important prophecy he makes about the destruction of Jerusalem. And he points out that that is a sign. The destruction of Jerusalem is a sign of his second coming. The Temple of Jerusalem was destroyed by Titus, which makes Titus the second coming of Jesus, which shows you that the Romans literally grafted themselves onto the Jewish lineage. Now, what we're doing today is we're looking at a book from Thies Voskuilen and Rosemary Sheldon called Operation Messiah. And they don't go as far as some of the other people that I've focused on in the Roman origins hypothesis. In fact, they don't go anywhere close to far enough. And they narrow the whole scope, not really saying that the Romans wrote the Gospels or the New Testament, but that they focus strictly on Paul, and not recognizing that the whole thing is fiction. They still contend that these events actually occurred, and that Paul was an intelligence agent of the Romans. So they recognize how blatantly Paul is pro-Roman and anti-Jew, but they don't kind of connect the dots and recognize that Jesus is almost as anti-Jew and pro-Roman as Paul is. And so they focus all of it on Paul, and it hurts their analysis. But it's good to go through it to look at their arguments and maybe dissect some of them. I think we're in chapter 8. We'll start here. Again, we see a high-ranking government official treating Paul, Jew, deserter, messianist, proselytizer, and instigator of riots, treating him extremely well. First, Centurion Julius had spared Paul's life. Then the chief Roman official of the island of Malta welcomed him into his home. Paul must have been one of the best treated Roman criminals the Romans ever arrested. Viewing this hospitality, we might suspect that, at least in Roman circles, it was obvious to some that Paul was never going to be convicted for any of the things of which he was accused. If the outcome of the events was that obvious, why go on with the journey with all of the costs involved? Acts goes on to say, quote, "The official's father was sick in bed, suffering from fever and dysentery. Paul went in to see him and, after prayer, placed his hands on him and healed him. When this had happened, the rest of the sick on the island came and were cured. They honored us in many ways, and when we were ready to sail, they furnished us with the supplies we needed." Had Paul really been able and willing to supernaturally cure relatives of Roman government personnel? It seems hardly likely that this quality would not be called upon once he was in Rome. He could have cured any Roman government official and even served as the emperor's personal physician. Yet, as we will see shortly, Paul's alleged healing powers were never going to be called upon at any time during his stay in Rome, nor did he offer them voluntarily. After 3 days spent in Syracuse, what's important to point out here is that this incident that they're talking about, when Paul is being sent to Rome and there's the ship that he's on has a wreck, and so it's I think on the island of Malta, and they rescue him and they allow Paul to stay there along with all the other people that are there. That same shipwreck, or at least a parallel shipwreck, occurs in Josephus's War of the Jews, with Josephus being on the ship, and basically the same events occurring. And so usually when you're decoding the Bible and decoding Josephus, when you see kind of superfluous language and or stories that are very difficult to believe literally, that is where that's where you look for parallels. That's where you look for shenanigans, where they're going to connect the two different scripts as part of their psychological operation, where you see stories duplicated, where you see language duplicated, where they use unfamiliar words or peculiar phrases. That's where you start looking for, okay, there's a parallel here. More or less, what I'm saying is that the Romans put an insane amount of work into this, and there are really no wasted words. You know, all of the words in the New Testament are there on purpose. Now, obviously, the New Testament could have been altered in the 2,000 years since, and I'm sure it was. But the core of it is, I think, very, very, very intentional. Okay, after 3 days spent in Syracuse and a stop at Rhegium, Paul arrived in Puteoli. The week-long stay there has been the subject of debate. How could Paul have been allowed to spend a week with friends delaying the transport, given that he's a prisoner? How could accommodation arrangements have been in the hands of prisoner Paul instead of the centurion? Several explanations have been offered, ranging from the deplorable state of that word is very blurry. The deplorable state of the inns along the route, to suspected tensions between the centurion and Paul that had been caused by traveling together for so long. Whichever explanation for the week-long stay is most viable, the alleged Christian friends on Puteoli seem to have had nothing to fear from the Roman military guarding Paul, just as had been the case with Paul's friends in Sidon. Why would Roman government officials allow such a subversive element to go ahead and influence other dissidents while on the way to a court case, if his beliefs were part of the charge against him? If Paul was not considered a subversive element, then why take all the trouble to bring him to Rome in the first place? Okay, this section is called The Arrival in Rome, 60 AD. Acts' description of Paul's life in Rome is very succinct and very uninformative. We really do not know what happened to him there. Scholars presume he was taken to Rome in chains and that he was tried and executed there in 62 AD, before being able to carry out his intended Spanish missionary work. This interpretation will not hold up to scrutiny. We do not really know what he was charged with. It is clear that what Paul was preaching had nothing to do with Jewish nationalism. He resembled no seditious Nazarene centered on Jerusalem. He never invited any messianists from Jerusalem to come and visit, neither a representative of the leadership nor a member of lower standing. Nor do we know if a trial actually took place, what the verdict was, or how Paul died. This has not stopped much speculation from taking place. This section is called Paul in Alleged Custody. When he arrived in Rome, Paul was allowed to live in his own accommodation with a soldier guarding him. That's Acts 28:16. This brief remark does not allow us to identify the soldier. A further detail is given by the Western text, however, where we are told the centurion handed him over to the Stratopedarchos. This has been interpreted to mean a centurion in charge of Castra Periginorum. This is where centurions sent on business to the emperor from their legions were housed and where prisoners from the provinces were held in custody. One scholar's interpretation of the centurion's title was that Paul was taken to the Castra Periginorum on the Celian Hill. Those occupying the camp were legionnaires stationed in the provinces, but on detached duty in Rome. Thus, they were foreigners. These soldiers were used as couriers for conducting prisoners for police purposes, but also as spies. In fact, under a later emperor, someone between Domitian and Hadrian, I guess that would be either Trajan or what's his name? The guy that he was there for just 2 years, from 96 to 98 AD. Can't remember his name right now though. He was a real old guy, and he was just they made him emperor basically to honor his loyal service, knowing that he was about to die. Anyway, the frumentarii stationed here were turned into Rome's secret service. If the centurion Julius were one of these officers, perhaps he was conducting one of his own back to Rome. We must not forget, however, that the evidence of Secret Service activity is from a source dating half a century later than Paul's stay in Rome. Therefore, the part of the Roman military that guarded Paul remains unknown. It is also uncertain where Paul lived while in Rome. It has been argued that he must have stayed in private lodgings near the Praetorian barracks located at the Porta Viminalis, just beyond the walls to the northeast of the city. During this time, he remained in what has been dubbed as remarkably light custody, with only one soldier watching him. He was allowed to receive visitors and discuss his brand of messianism freely. There is no mention of these visitors being watched or interrogated, let alone arrested. In reality, if Paul were a messianist prisoner, it would be very unlikely that the Romans would not have monitored his dealings with the outside world. At the very least, he might have been engaged in discussions with Jewish religious elements that had caused quite a bit of unrest all over the empire, not to mention in Rome itself. If Paul were still working undercover, however, they could have monitored the comings and goings of Paul's visitors, and that is why they let him operate the way he did in Rome for at least 2 years. If the charge against Paul was treason and being a threat to the empire, why was he walking the streets with a wonderful amount of liberty granted to him, without the smallest hindrance being put in his way? Some have argued that the lightness of Paul's custody was caused by the weakness of the case against him, as indicated in the documentation sent with him to Rome. This explanation seems unsatisfactory. If the case was so weak, they would have released him instantly. Another option would have been to speed up the process and get him into a courtroom as soon as possible, if only to free his military guards for other duties. Could he have lived under Roman military guard for 2 years because he was being protected, not incarcerated? After all, there had been plenty of attacks on his life, so there was good reason to protect him. Was Paul ever in custody at all, or was he just kept in protective custody until he could be debriefed? As much as scholars love to present evidence about Roman internees, I guess that's from internecine, I don't know, or just from intern, about Roman internees, that's with 2 E's, Christian and otherwise, describing their conditions and their sufferings, there is no evidence that Paul was among them. The fact is that Acts only records Paul's imprisonment in Philippi. It never mentions any imprisonment in Rome. When pressed for details of how Paul could have held up under this arrangement and bad treatment, held up under the imprisonment and bad treatment, most scholars give a theological response: Paul's indomitable spirit. The fact is, we have no evidence he suffered at all. Certainly, softening the confinement of prisoners was not the usual Roman policy. Both magistrates and prison guards were accountable in law for how they kept prisoners. Laxness in the method of constraint was punishable, especially if the prisoner escaped. Okay, we're going to stop right there, and we'll take over at that location tomorrow. Hopefully everything will go well, and we'll, get back on the daily schedule. Thanks for tuning in today. Like, share, subscribe, and comment as you see fit. And in the meanwhile, come back tomorrow. And in the meanwhile, have a great night.